Okay, first off, let's talk about for each loops. You don't really need them, but the College Board does use them sometimes in their multiple choice questions, so you should know about them. If you recall way back when we were looking over things that you don't get subtracted points for, they use this term enhanced loops. So this is what they mean, for each loops. If you're familiar with Python, it's similar to how loops work in Python. They're for loops. They eliminate out-of-bounds exceptions, but it doesn't do anything you can't do with regular for loops. So I recommend that you really stay with the for loops for your FRQs and just understand what's going on in a for each loop for like the multiple choice. We didn't teach you this early on because it hides so much of the important stuff we need to know about indices when working with for loops: the start, the stop, the increment. That level of control is lost when you go and work with a for loop or for each loop. But code-wise, like words you have to type, it's much shorter. They were added in Java in version 1.5, 2004, and they officially became a part of the AP exam in 2008. We'll show you a bunch of examples of using for each loops with arrays and also array lists. So here's your standard for loop in this array of strings: apple, banana, coconut, durian, and fig. And this is a for loop that goes with it to print out each element. Starts at 0, stops just before its length, increments by 1. Pretty standard stuff. At this point, I think it's muscle memory for you to type out and write a for loop. Here's the for each loop version of this. Notice the declaration of your SA words stays the same, but for word remains there. String S word colon SA words. This is how you would print out each element in this array of strings using a for each loop. Let's go ahead and highlight the intricacies here. Notice that in a for each loop, one by one, each element is copied into the S word variable. Notice how it's being declared over here, S word. It's like a temporary variable. It holds each element, doesn't do anything about indices. Here in this slide, we emphasize that the type must match the type of array or array list that you're working with. In this case, it's an array of strings, so S word must be a string. Secondly, some details to pay attention to. Notice the colon. Notice the name of your array or array list on the right-hand side of the colon. Okay, let's take a look at another example. Here's your standard array of integers being declared, and one at a time we print each number out using a for loop. Notice the use of square brackets and the index. Pretty standard. Here's that same code written with a for each loop. Stare at it for a bit. I think it's kind of straightforward. You lose the indexes. You're just dealing with elements. Now, the one that has a bit more of a difference, take a look at this one. Here's a for loop printing out the strings inside an array list. Take a moment, stare at it, process it. Okay. You see the first bunch, you use the add function to put things into your array list. Then we have our for loop. Same kind of indices. Notice with array list we must use dot size. Then I++. Now we use the get function instead of square brackets to access elements inside an array list. All right, here's the for each loop part. Notice the adding stays the same. Stare at the for each loop. Doesn't look much different, eh? Compared to the previous for each loops. Doesn't really matter whether you have an array or array list. The for loop code differs a lot. The for each loop code for array and array list, printing everything out, really looks the same. You have the type that matches the type of elements being stored in your array list, and then you have the name of said array list. Pretty standard. No real surprises. And let's move on to talk about some things you should pay attention to in terms of style. Click. Okay. So you never need to use a for each loop. Everything you can do with a for each loop, you can do with a for loop. There is a specific case where it is useful to use it, and that's when you need to access every element in the array or array list without replacing or removing. You may consider using a for each loop there. And it's using a for loop for all other cases. So for you to get some practice, really just reading for each loops, you have this worksheet due on Friday. So have a look over it. The solutions are posted on the APCS Lowell website. If you get stuck on anything, email me. Perhaps I'll make a slide or two going over it. And that's the slide presentation on for each loops. Questions? All right. So we switch over PowerPoints. Let me scroll down a bunch. This is the first part of class talking about for each loops. Next we talk about multiple choice practice for the AP exam. So we're going to go over a bunch of miscellaneous things related to the multiple choice section, some reminders and some tips and tricks that may help you save some time or approach the problem in different ways on the AP exam multiple choice portion of it. So here, I'm reminding you, you can distribute different kinds of logical operators being ands, ors, and nots. So here we show you an example of distributing the exclamation mark, also known as the not operator. So here I would read it as not the quantity true or false. That can be rewritten and distributed as not true and not false. Flipping true, flipping false, the opposite of or is and. So that's the same as false and true, which is really the same as false. So all these things that you see here, you can think about this as another fancy way of writing false. Formally, this is De Morgan's law. If you study electrical engineering later, it's quite useful. They make use of that a lot in their logic gates. Next, we have some more examples. You could distribute the ands and the ors in these logical operators. So notice this statement here, stare at it for a bit. The color coding should help to identify the distribution. Notice how A and gets moved to be with B or C. The same thing happens with the ors. A or the quantity B and C is the same as A or B and the quantity A or C. You may be given it one way, perhaps you want to approach it the other. For example, if A is false here, you know that this overall statement is false. You see that A is true, and you know this overall statement is true. Perhaps you want to undistribute in some way or fashion. 121. Let's move on. A more practical example of distributing the not operator. It's the opposite. So when you read this, inequality here, this is saying not your variable nx is not less than 3. This is the same as saying your variable nx is greater than or equal to 3. Often the mistake is to leave out the equal sign when thinking about opposites. Okay, strictly less than, the opposite of strictly less than is greater than or equal to. Any questions on these logical operator tricks? All right, so next up, we have a little bit of review on 2D arrays. Part of our focus with FRQs this week is 2D arrays, so think back to not Grid World, Game of Life. Here's a reminder of how these 2D arrays work. 2D arrays often paired with nested loops. 2D arrays are arrays of arrays. So here's your alphabet array. Notice that the alphabet array, its length is 4. It contains 4 individual arrays inside of it. If you look at the index, let's say like if you wanted to access alphabet square bracket 1, that would be the array that contains H, I, J, K, L, M, and N. Each element inside the alphabet array is an array. When you want to work through each of their arrays, okay, those are its rows, so you'd use one for loop to access each of those arrays. Notice R stands for rows. You can see I'm getting closer to the nested loop idea. Your outer loop is rows, your inner loops will be columns. Notice here we have the introduction of that inner loop working through the columns, also known as the individual elements inside each of those arrays. Now we're printing out the whole alphabet, A, B, C, D, so on and so forth. Things to pay attention to. Notice the differences here. This asks for the array, the length of the array, the inner arrays. This one checks the length of an individual array so that you can print out each letter. With 2D arrays, you have 2 indices. I like to think about them as coordinates, rows and columns. Row position like 0, column position 5. That corresponds to 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like the letter F. Pretty standard stuff. Remember rows and columns, inner loop, then outer loop. Rows and columns in that order, and you'll be fine along the AP exam. Here's the for each loop variant of it, just to show you that this works too. And a tip, if you're making a study guide or making a cheat sheet for the AP exam, because they have really no way of enforcing a physical cheat sheet next to you, you might want to copy something like this down just to remind you, like, or a smaller version of this down, so you remind yourself, oh, I need a nested loop to work with 2D arrays. This is how I would print out all the elements, if ever you think you'll forget. Right, so after those bits and tips, you'll notice that this morning I posted the multiple choice practice you have for this week. You have 15 questions. These 15 questions are the most accurate and most up-to-date example of what to expect on the AP exam. So it comes from this course description, mainly geared towards teachers, but you as students have access to this if you do some Googling. It tells you what is on the exam, it goes over some concepts, shows you some examples. What's important is this sample exam on page 191. This is what we're assigning you to do by Friday, these 15 multiple choice questions. Some may be easy, some may be hard, and I think even the best of us will make a couple mistakes. So while you're recording down your answers in this little table, so we can check it over, there is 3 reflection questions you have to do. It's the same thing repeated 3 times. Write about a mistake or misconception that you had. Ideally, it's 3 sentences long. You tell me about the mistake you made, how you fixed it, perhaps the wrong answer choice and what led you there, and so you can learn from it. If everyone gets a different question wrong, then we essentially have a detailed explanation on each of the questions after Friday, and I can compile that and paste it all together for you to review at your own leisure. The motivation from this comes from my college courses where like really big lecture hall of like 300 people for like a general education course like chemistry or like calculus, introductory, whatever. We would have one person make like a Google Doc. Like one person, usually they have a really good set of notes. They would share that publicly with like the entire class, and that Google Doc would be spread around all 300 people. And we'd each do our part in contributing like some valuable thing from our notes so that we can collectively create a really, really good study guide. Yeah, 300 people chipping away at a coursework to review for the final, and we can all study from it. Hopefully I can produce said study guide for you all. I'll do the compiling part, but spend some time and really like put in the work for these reflections. Go over your mistakes. If you happen to be one of the few that don't make any mistakes in these 15 questions, then we'll talk. Perhaps you'll do some other kind of reflecting, but I highly doubt it. Okay. There are other College Board approved resources that we'll do and share with you to practice. Pacing wise, I think it ends up being 2 minutes a question, 40 multiple choice an hour, 30 minutes-ish. So here's your first 15. I think we have another set of like 25. We don't have a full-length exam per se, but there are other resources the College Board released to get you prepared. Some may be copies of others. Be careful with how you practice. The progress checks on AP Classroom are good, but you don't want to like test yourself too much on this. Don't cast such wide of a net, especially when older exams like test you on more things you need to know. So really study the stuff we give you in detail. Make sure every question makes sense, and you'll be fine. Yes, I do think you should give yourself a sense of the pacing, roughly 2 minutes a question. So 15 questions, like give yourselves about 30 minutes, give or take. That way is when you take the actual AP exam, you're not surprised by that pacing. With distance learning, it was hard for us to give you a strict like 50-minute exam, hard cutoff, multiple choice, whatever, right? So you have to be disciplined in that regards and set up that environment for yourself. Cool. All right. Well, that's all I have to say in today's lecture. Pretty short, to the point. You guys can go, what, 8 minutes early. You're welcome to stay if you have further questions. But yeah, have a great Monday.